Very warm welcome to everyone that's joined. Fantastic to have so many of you online to join our third online food talks. My name is Dan Crossley. I'm Executive Director of an organisation called the Food Ethics Council. We're an NGO trying to accelerate the shift to fair and resilient food systems. We're doing this in partnership with a number of other organisations who we'll hear about in a moment. But it's fantastic that you're joining. What I'll do is hand over to one of my co-hosts, Avrilia, from Impact Hub King's Cross, who will just explain briefly about the Food Talks partnership and the sort of housekeeping for today, and then we'll launch into the rest of the session. So Avrilia, over to you.
Thanks, Dan. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Just a few logistics stuff for our event today. As Dan said earlier, we are recording this session. Feel free to turn off your video if that makes you uncomfortable. However, I encourage you to keep it on, as that creates quite a nice environment between us. As you can see, you've all been muted. So the only people that can unmute themselves are the hosts and the speakers. However, we really want to encourage discussion between you. Those who have joined our previous online events, you could see that it was quite dynamic. So please use the chat box to discuss anything you need between us or ask any questions. We'll have 2 breaks to pose questions to the speakers. I will only ask kindly that if you have a question for the speakers, just put a Q in front so it's easy for us to recognize what are questions for each other and what are for the speakers. Yeah, just to go back onto the Food Talks series, this is part of our regular series that has been running for a few years now, and it is Food Talks is a partnership of 4 organizations: Impact Hub King's Cross, Food Ethics Council, Organico, and London Food Link, which is part of Sustain. The idea of the Food Talk series is to stimulate debate and empower people to take action on critical food issues. The theme of this year's Food Talks has been we're all emergency respondents now. Where we started designing it this year, we were expecting to run in our space in Impact Hub King's Cross. However, due to the situation, this is our 3rd online Food Talks, where we have focused on our response to the COVID challenges to our food systems. I'd also like to briefly mention an opportunity from Impact Hub King's Cross. So we have launched a business support program called New Roots, which is supporting people from BAME backgrounds to start new enterprises. I'm going to add the link into the chat box. If you fit that criteria and you want to apply, you're welcome. Also share it with people that might be interested. It's a free program, and we also have opportunities for people to become mentors in these programs and other business support programs we are running for social enterprises. And that's all from my side. Dan, back to you to introduce today's topic and the speakers.
Great. Thank you very much, Avrilia. Just to reiterate, echo what Avrilia said, we are keen that you, there's lots of you there, keen that you join, participate. There's 2 ways. There's the chat box, as Avrilia said. There's also going to be a Mentimeter poll in a few moments, which some of you will have used before, but it's just a simple way to feed in some responses to what you think about this and where you come from, so that we have a sense of who's in the room. So my name's, as I said, Dan Crossley from the Food Ethics Council, co-hosting with Avrilia from Impact Hub King's Cross. The format for today is, as I say, after my intro, and we've had a few questions on Mentimeter, then we'll dive in and hear from our first pair of speakers, contributors, who'll speak for 6-7 minutes each. We'll then take questions from the chat box. Avrilia will coordinate that, pull in some of those questions and put those to the first pair of speakers. Then we'll run the same process again with the second pair of speakers, and then again opportunity for questions, and then we'll bring it together at the end. So we'll finish promptly by 1:30 UK time, for those of you that are on UK time. I'm delighted that we've got a fantastic set of speakers, contributors today, from people from 4 organisations that I've got huge admiration for. We'll be hearing from Kimberley Bell, who some of you will know, founder of Small Food Bakery in Nottingham, in sort of East Midlands here in the UK, who I heard speak at Oxford Real Farming Conference 2 or 3 years ago. Got really inspiring stories. We'll hear from Ching, who's member of IPES-Food, who again we're big supporters of. Olivia Lashuta spoke at our 20th anniversary a couple of years ago, and also is a senior researcher at the Third World Network. We'll hear from Tom Crompton, who's the director of the Common Cause Foundation, talking all things values and beyond. And then Sally Uren, who's chief exec at Forum for the Future. And I declare my interest in, association rather. I used to work at Forum for the Future until about 7.5 years ago. So Forum for the Future, a global sustainability NGO. Sally can explain more later. So that's who we've got lined up to hear from today, and I'm really, really excited. The topic we're addressing is a big one, addressing multiple emergencies, which is a slightly scary big topic. And again, we'll come back to questions about whether that's a helpful way of thinking about it, about framing, about values, but crucially about actions that we can take. And clearly we are still in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. And you know, this is the third in the series. We've been doing this online series, and the first two, just to give you a flavour for those of you that weren't here, the first one was very much about sort of short-term emergency response. We heard from people like Dee Woods, Kath Dalmeny, and others about what needs to happen in the short term, and about starting to build resilience. In the second one, we heard was from emergency to recovery, so the sort of notion of build back better. How can we start to embed resilience, make some of the amazing positive responses that we are seeing stick, what some of the positive shifts and actions that are out there that we can do more on. And then the purpose of today is to, I guess, broaden out a bit. We're not in any way underplaying or underestimating the COVID-19 pandemic. We're still very much in the middle of that in the UK and in lots of countries around the world. So we're not underestimating the impact, that's devastating impact that's having on people in a whole multitude of different ways. The purpose of today is just pause slightly for breath. If we can, take that broader lens, and the purpose again of today is to identify opportunities in our collective response to COVID-19 to move forwards rather than backwards in addressing the multiple emergencies we face. So whether that's on biodiversity, climate, obesity, the list could go on. So how can we move forwards rather than backwards in addressing some of those other emergencies without neglecting the response that needs to happen, the short-term emergency response to COVID-19. I would just like to say a thank you to Esme Fairbairn Foundation, who have kindly supported financially this online series and made us a small contribution, which is great. So a big thank you to them. I would just to finish off one more slide, if I may, and then I'll move back to the plenary view. Okay, my screen is gone, so I'll leave that for now. I'll come back to that. The point is for today, we've got about an hour and 20 minutes to go through and hear insights from some leading people. So I will stop and in a minute hand over to them. Before I do, I said I want to do this Mentimeter. So if you do have either a smartphone to hand, or you can open up another browser on your computer if you're using one, and go into Mentimeter. I'll explain how to do that in a moment. The idea is just to answer a couple of quick questions that will help us understand more about who is here and what we can do. So bear with me. Sorry, I'll get there eventually, I promise. So while I'm just doing that, so the idea of Mentimeter is there's going to be 3 or 4 questions up front, and there'll be 2 or 3 questions right at the end of the session. So hopefully on your screen you can now see this. What I'd like you to do is say either open in your smartphone or in a separate browser. At the top, go to www.menti.com. So MENTI.com. So www.menti.com, and enter the code without any spaces 396371. So say that's in a separate browser if you have it, or on your smartphone. www.menti.com, and use the code 396371. If you're having problems with it, don't worry, you can add comments into the chat box and we'll look at those as well. But I can see a lot of people responding already. The first question is hopefully a straightforward one, just to have a sense of who's joining us. So which one of these best describes the sector you're from? There's quite a few coming from the third sector NGO world. quite a few interested individuals, some from academia, a fair number from food and farming businesses as well. Just give you another few moments just to finish that before we move on to the next slide. Okay, thank you, everybody. So we've got a good mix of people, quite a few from policy, a fair number from business, a sort of bias towards third sector NGO, which is what we perhaps would expect. We'll come back to that a bit later on to ask one or two questions about where you're from, one or two insights you've got. But rather than stop too long on this, I want to come back to the main screen and dive into our first pair of speakers. So, firstly, we're going to hear from Kimberley Bell from Small Food Bakery, who some of you will know, and then we'll hear from Ching, Ching. So over to you. So 6-7 minutes, 6-7 minutes in. I think Kimberley, I've seen there's a note, Kimberley Bell's internet went down, but hopefully has rejoined, and Avrilia can make her a co-host if she's not already. I don't know if Kimberley, are you there? If not, what I suggest is, I think Kimberley is there. We'll just give Kimberley a few moments just to join, and then we'll hand over to Ching. Yeah, the Kimberley's there. If you can unmute yourself, Kim. We'll hear from Kim. So Kim can give a perspective on. I want to hear what you're seeing from your small food bakery in Nottingham, and what you think from a sort of local grassroots response we should be doing. Over to you.
Hi, can you hear me, Dan?
Yes, I can.
Great. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm here in Nottingham at Small Food Bakery. I'm working today, so I've just nipped out. Just for those of you who don't know us, we're a small bakery based in an urban part of the city. And I started 6 years ago as an experiment because I became very interested in food systems, and I wanted to know, I guess, if I didn't agree with the big industrial food system, or if I felt it was problematic, I wanted to know what we could do about it. The way that I learn and the way that I'm naturally inclined is that I just wanted to get on with rebuilding something in a better way. So Small Food started as an experiment 6 years ago to see what a kind of ground up grassroots food system might look like. And I guess it's sort of masquerading as a bakery, really. That sort of started with ingredient sourcing, and the important thing for me was to really get back to the ground and where ingredients were grown and what was happening at soil level. And it's become a big social experiment as well, trying to understand how people fit into the food system and how our choices as bakers, or as, I suppose, semi-industrial food manufacturers, albeit at small scale, how our choices actually impact the environment, how they impact wider society. So everything I've done in building Small Food, which I built from just me on my own in a bakery, up to now 7 full-time bakers. And by bakers, actually, everybody who works at Small Food, they bake, and they also make other things and preserve and cook, and they also serve our customers directly. So it works quite differently from other bakeries in that sense. But really, it sort of evolved into thinking a lot about how we fit into society. And I guess, without really being able to articulate it in the beginning, when I set out, I was trying to work out how to decommodify our food system. And this was the big question for me, was how do we do that? And I started thinking a lot about identity, and that's really been the lens through which has been most interesting for me to explore ingredients, the identity of ingredients, the identity of land, and the identity of the people that work in the system, which often gets overlooked, particularly when you're discussing bigger picture issues such as environmental impact or kind of health or public health impacts. I think the people who actually make the food often get forgotten, and I think we've got to really get back to the kind of crux of those values. If we're going to change anything at all, the people working within the system need to feel very differently about their role within society. And I suppose that ties into, it's a very complicated topic. I could talk about this for a long time, but it really does tie us in nicely to what's happened to us since the COVID lockdown. And the thing that really sticks in my mind is it's all been about people. And our response to the lockdown was very people focused. as is the nature of our business, I don't think we changed. We just responded in the way that we would have responded to anything else, and the way that we've built the business from the beginning. So we're lucky enough in our team to have a baker who's from northern Italy, and he was watching things unfurl in Italy, and we had a bit of a heads up, we could say, as to what was to come. So I was privileged to be able to spend the 2 weeks in the run-up to lockdown in lots of one-to-one and small group meetings with the team and other suppliers, really talking about how we felt about it. And I think that's what was at the crux of it, was how do we feel? And we've really assessed the risk and put in measures and changed things based on how we felt, rather than trying to react or overreact to the crisis. In doing that, we've sort of seen other businesses panic and maybe bring in measures. Disposable packaging is a really simple one, and I don't want to trivialise the changes that people have needed to make, but it's really easy to just drop all of those sort of nice to haves, if you like, when a crisis hits. And I feel like one thing we've done very well is hold on to our values. So we talked to our customers a lot. We really kind of engaged with what they needed. We didn't do things like rationing or limiting the amount of bread people had. We talked to them, and we made sure we knew that they were delivering to their friend down the road. So why would we limit, you know, what they were having? And yeah, we've just basically tried to respond to what people wanted. In a nutshell, the big change for our business has been that people have required less visits to a shop, so therefore they've needed us to provide a more diverse range of services. And diversity was certainly one of our kind of core values in any case, from farming right into the bakery. We've always had a really diverse product range, and for me that's got to be one of the key to kind of having a sustainable food system, is for people not to specialise too much, and to have a diversity of skills and kind of multiplicity to the way that they approach things. So we've become much more of a grocer. I guess we've observed a shift away from the supermarkets, and maybe people are spending more greatly with us. They certainly have shifted a lot of their entertainment money towards the money that, you know, towards spending with us, because they want to eat better at home during lockdown. So I think we've picked up turnover from restaurant trade and those other things. But I think people have realised with the supermarkets, as far as I'm concerned, they're our competition. They were the thing that I always wanted to be against. And for me, the supermarket's USP is that people can shop very privately and anonymously. So therefore their food choices aren't being judged, and they can get away with kind of a lot. And the other thing is it's super convenient, and they can just rush in on their way to and from. And both of those things have kind of dissolved. And it's been interesting to observe how, when those two-ish big things have dissolved, how shopping with us, which was always a bit inconvenient, a bit expensive, and maybe a little less private because we're a full-serve shop with person to person, suddenly those things have actually become pluses. And I think we suddenly developed, for the first time, some kind of competitive advantage over the supermarkets, which has usurped the fact that our produce is more expensive than those larger food industries. So I don't know if that gives you a bit of a picture as to how we've been doing, or if there's anything in addition you want me to say.
No, that's brilliant, Kimberley. Thank you for that. That's we'll come back to you. There'll be, I'm sure, some questions coming through in a few minutes once we've heard from Ching. But I love hearing your story again, and how your kind of core values around diversity have been at the heart of this, and your people-centered approach to everything. And certainly from conversation we've been having with businesses large and small recently, there's this notion of those that are already kind of embraced ethics and have a strong ethical character, as they come into the crisis, perhaps are better prepared and more flexible than some of those that are perhaps jumping on the bandwagon or trying to do things that weren't fully embedded. But it's brilliant to hear your story.
Can I just say one more thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Just occurred to me is that when the lockdown first started, we got some very bizarre messages all of a sudden from brand new customers, and a lot of people saying, we want to support local during this coronavirus. And I don't want to downplay the sentiment of that, it's appreciated. But the one thing that comes out of this, and something I really want to start talking about, is that it's been very bloody obvious that it's been us supporting them. And my team have worked tirelessly throughout this time and given up a lot of their own kind of individual privileges that perhaps some other people have had during a quieter time or time off work in order to serve. And I think it's really important to remember that people in the industry should feel proud to serve And it's not about customers supporting us, it's about everyone supporting each other. And I think if we could try to change the language and towards that, I think it would be really helpful going forward.
Absolutely, and certainly echo that. I think that's a very powerful point. And yeah, treating each other with compassion, and acknowledging the huge effort and sacrifice that lots of people on the front line or in communities around the country and the world have been putting in, and trying to value and reward that. Thank you, Kimberley. Really important point. So do keep questions coming into the broader group. Do keep questions and comments coming in. They're already started to come in on the chat. Do add those in as we go through. Next, I want to turn to Ching. So Limley Ching from IPES-Food, International Panel Experts on Sustainability Food, but also Third World Network, which is a network that started in, I think, Malaysia about 35 or so years ago. And we thought, I guess, the sort of building on what Kimberley did, which very much about kind of a local response. I guess what we're doing today is jumping between the global and the local. I think it's really important to do that. So I guess to get a bit more of an international response and to hear about, I guess, the importance of sustainable farming and agroecology within all this debate, wanted to hear from Ching. So Ching, over to you.
Thank you very much, for inviting me to share these reflections. I come from Malaysia, and I work with an NGO based there, the Third World Network. So I'm approaching this very much from a global perspective. I'm also a member of IPES-Food, the Independent Panel of Experts on Sustainable Food Systems. And we put out a communique recently, which is available on our website. I think I can put that in the chat later, the web link. But I just wanted to start out by saying that in many respects, the pandemic has really been a wake-up call for food systems. As we've seen around the world, not just, we've had obvious supply problems in the West and in the northern countries, but we've seen how lockdown measures imposed by governments have really, impacted particularly on the poor and vulnerable. And I think what has dawned on us as well is that these crises and the fragility of the food system will be compounded by intersecting climate change, biodiversity, health, economic crisis. So this is something that I think we need to use as a window to really talk about a food systems transformation. Because we've seen, and as given by the wonderful example by Kimberley earlier, we've seen this glimpse of what new and more resilient food systems could look like, because communities have stepped up to plug the gaps. Governments have come in to take measures that would have previously been thought unimaginable, to ensure that food is provided and and the production continues. We've got examples, for example, in Kerala, women's networks coming together to cook for communities, to distribute food to communities who are in need. And I think that, we ought to take this time to really then just stop talking about tweaking unsustainable food and agriculture systems, that we got to move away from that. We really need to call for transformative change in an integrated and holistic systemic way that provides long-term solutions. The first step, of course, is that we need to move out of the conditions that lock in industrial agriculture. We know, and this is evidenced by numerous reports from very authoritative organizations from the UN and FAO and the environment, UN Environment, for example. We know that current paths are unsustainable. They contribute to climate change and biodiversity loss. They have not fed people healthily. And in fact, industrial agriculture actually has driven habitat loss and creates the conditions for viruses to emerge and spread. And this is one of the possible causes of the coronavirus emergence. And we know that this will happen again and again unless we change our practices. We have seen during lockdowns especially that corporate concentration in the food system and the supply chain has led to bottlenecks, and it hasn't worked. So what do? We need to really undertake structural reform. And as IPES-Food, we've called very strongly for several years now for a paradigm shift from industrial food systems to diversified agroecological systems. I think many of you will be familiar with agroecology. It's an integrated approach that applies ecological and social principles to the design and management of food and agricultural systems. Now, it isn't just about environmental practices or being more sustainable, but agroecology is fundamentally about empowering people. It's about empowering producers and communities as agents of change. It recognizes the innovations of local communities, local farmers, traditional knowledge and their practices and experiences. And it places a strong focus on the rights of women, youth, indigenous peoples. And I think this is a good, it's really a unique feature of agroecology as opposed to other agricultural approaches, because it's holistic and integrated, and therefore it can reconcile economic, social, and environmental dimensions simultaneously. I just wanted to, just very quickly, I know I don't have a lot of time, but just to highlight a few key points that I think is important for our topic in terms of addressing multiple emergencies. We know, first of all, that agroecology is biodiversity-based agriculture. It doesn't use chemical inputs. It allows beneficial organisms, pollinators, for example, to thrive and to fulfill the ecosystem functions and the role that they play in ecosystems. It's got a territorial approach that protects important ecosystems. We've seen from examples all over the world or in parts of the world that agroecology can actually help farmers adapt to climate change. We know this is a very real and present danger, climate change. And we've seen how in Central America, for example, agroecological farms were able to withstand hurricanes much better than conventional farms. Importantly, they were able to recover more quickly. They were able to recover, and that's a key important feature of resilience, the ability to not only withstand shocks, but to recover from those shocks. We know that agroecology, and there's been reports that have looked at this, that could contribute to dietary diversity and high quality diets by providing nutritious, fresh food, and this of course has to be made accessible and affordable to all. And we know that diet-related health conditions that make people susceptible to diseases in the first place have to be addressed. So what I'm saying is that agroecology, through addressing these different dimensions, for example, if it's biodiversity, climate change, or health, can actually contribute as a systemic solution to address some of these problems that we're facing. Another important dimension, of course, is in the social and economic side of markets, right? So agroecology depends very much on territorial markets and short supply chains. I think one of the key features is that it short circuits long supply chains, it short circuits industrial food systems to enable access to food, ensuring greater value goes to farmers and reducing vulnerability to disruptions in international markets. Now, I think we can see that this importance has come to light more during this crisis, during lockdowns, particularly where supply chains have been disrupted. We've had the example that Kimberley had elaborated on, very real personal example of how they have been able to support the community around them. And this has happened in countries around the world during lockdown, where small-scale farmers and community gardeners, for example, in Zimbabwe, have plugged food supply gaps that bigger commercial farmers were not able to do. We've seen expansion of community-supported agriculture, for example, in China, which allows people to support local farmers by entering into direct producer-consumer marketing schemes. Okay, so there are many examples around the world of agroecology and the change that is needed for food systems. Now, of course, we need political support to flourish, right? And I think what we do need and what needs to change would be what I would call, or what actually Olivier de Schutter has called food democracy. It's about allowing citizens to actually actively shape what the future of food and farming looks like. It's about developing and integrating participatory food policies. And this has happened successfully in several countries, whether it's at local, municipal, or national level. In Brazil, in Canada, for example, with formal structures like food policy councils. But essentially, it's about changing us as citizens to take active action to shape our food systems. So I think that there are different ways that we can do this, and I think people talk about scaling, and I'd like to put forward 3 aspects that we need to scale up. That's about changing the institutional investment, policy, and legal environment to support agroecology. We need to scale out, which is about replication, increasing the numbers of farmers who are practicing agroecology. And this is, for example, taken up by many farmers' organizations around the world, including La Via Campesina. And we also need to scale deep, which is about enabling durable processes of change, of mindsets and of values. And I think that if we look at these three aspects, we can actually use agroecology to provide the tools to address multiple emergencies so that we build back, not just better, but differently and in a transformative way. So thank you very much. I hope I'll be happy to take questions here. Thanks. I'll look at the chat.
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Ching. That was fantastic about the power of agroecology and its ability to address a number of these emergencies that we're facing. There's quite a few comments and questions starting to appear in the chat box. So I'll come to Aurelia in just a moment. I think questions for both Kimberley and for Ching. Before we do that, I just want to go back, because I just like technical challenge before. I just want to quickly go back to Mentimeter, if I may, if you'll humour me, just to finish a couple of questions on that. So just want to get a sense of who's in the room. Some people have already started to fill this in, but just wanted to know where people are. Obviously, we're based in the UK, and we recognise the majority of people joining will be in the UK. We've got a strong Southeast England bias, as we suspected. But good if people could go back to menti.com, and again with that code 396371, just very quickly fill in where you are. It's great to have some people joining from other parts of Europe and from and beyond as well, rest of the world. Just give you a moment or two on that before we move on. Brilliant, thank you. Now, it's just helpful just to quickly look, you can have a moment or two to do that. I'll go back now to the main room and to Aurelia, perhaps to feed in one or two questions or comments for either Ching or Kimberley. Aurelia.
Yes, sure, thanks, Dan. Yeah, I have a couple of questions that I'd like to pose. First, perhaps I can start from the bottom and think your point around the agroecological farms. I think there are already some responses in the chat on this question, but it would be nice to hear your views in front of everyone. Tanya is mentioning that agroecology, there is this consumption that is very small scale. Is there any evidence that agroecology can work in larger scale and feed the growing population in the world?
Thank you very much for shall I answer, or shall I take a few questions? Sorry.
No, go ahead. I'll pose some other questions.
Thank you so much for the questions. Yeah, I think the evidence is there that agroecology can produce a lot. The few actually dimensions and elements, I think, to this kind of question. Firstly, of course, we see that in terms of productivity, agroecology, there are reports that look at how much it can increase yields if we just look at yields, right? Just as particularly in developing country farms, right? That's one. Secondly, we've seen evidence that with support, farms can transition, but that requires institutional support, policy support, and basically financing, right, to help farmers transition out. The other thing is that, of course, when we look at the measurements, and this is one thing that IPES-Food raised in its first report, From Uniformity to Diversity, is that when we look at how we measure agriculture and what are the important things that matter, right? If we look at yield, that's one dimension, but agroecology is actually contributing to multiple dimensions. And if we just focus on things like yield, it masks all the other dimensions that, for example, in terms of environmental sustainability, in terms of healthier food, in terms of things that matter to people, what matters to well-being. So one call has been that we really need to change the matrices by which we measure agriculture. And that we can see that farms do contribute, agroecological farms do contribute to productivity because they produce more than yield of the single crop. Many agroecological farms multi-crop, do lots of rotation, and produce many different dimensions, both animal and plant at the same time. So when we put all this together, we can see that these farms are truly productive. On the question of whether it's only for small scale farms or for large scale farms, I do know of examples in Latin America, for example, where they are applying agroecological principles to larger farms and large farms, and find that this is possible. That has been possible through landscape approaches to do this. So I think there are many opportunities to scale up and scale out, and also increase the number of farmers that are practicing agroecology.
Thank you, Ching. I have a question that is, perhaps both Ching and Kimberley, you can address it, and it's kind of an inference from other comments and questions that people say. So we have Catherine here in the chat room, who heads up the external PR team for Borough Market. And basically she had a question around whether in our response to the COVID-19, did some of the traders have to kind of exchange the emergency food response towards some sustainability principles that they had? For example, it wasn't easy to find reusable containers. Someone else also mentions how do we see this new economic paradigms, such as Kate Raworth's donut economics or circular economy, having a shift towards agroecology and more resilient food systems. So overall, my question is there a trade-off there? Is there a trade-off towards better food, better service of the consumer towards sustainability? Or is there a way that we can move together towards a better world that combines the two? Either Ching or Kimberley, you can respond to that.
Okay, maybe I try first. Yeah, I think the concepts of circular economy, solidarity economies are very much prevalent in agroecology, because we see agroecology really as a way to short circuit long linear supply chains. It's about relocalizing, making food systems more resilient. It doesn't mean that we don't need trade, for example, because coming from a developing country and from a net food importing country, that's also important, right? What we need to ensure is that there are fairer terms of trade. But in terms of actually, I think agroecology really has good examples in terms of, for example, community-supported agriculture, even procurement from government locally from agroecological farms. We've seen examples of that in Brazil, for example, to provide for schools and hospitals. Many of these very exciting alternatives are happening despite the lack of policy and legal support towards agroecology. And I think these can show us the way forward of what future food systems could look like.
Thank you, Ching. Kimberley, any thoughts, any additional thoughts on that?
Yeah, I suppose it occurs to me just to reiterate the point about we need to stop tweaking the broken system, and actually we need to look at something completely different. And where we're at, I think, is, or what I'm really interested in is, where is the intersection between agroecology and social ecology? And obviously I live in a city, so I'm thinking about it very much from an urban perspective. And I think between those two things, that's where the answers to rebuilding the food system in a better way lie for me. And all of the values, such as diversification and kind of looking at the value of land and resources and people and valuing them correctly, I don't know, there isn't a way to trade those off for me. Like, for me, it was very much, if I can't trade, I won't trade. And we've managed to hold on to all of the ways in which we do things. We're still working with the same supply chains. We're still using returnable packaging. We're very fortunate in that we have a bit of space where we've been able to implement distancing, but still allow customers to bring back their reusable packaging. We've used a website and some simple strategies to make sure they get refunds on all the packaging. And actually, I think it's just built loads of loyalty because it's allowed our customers to hold on to their values as well. And I think we would have been treading really dangerous ground if we'd suddenly changed the way we did things as a kind of panic response to COVID. I think it would have really undermined the work that we did over the last 6 years. And I think that's what spurred me and my team on. And that's why we've been working so hard, is we felt like now was the time we really had to prove our point. And we've always been working towards a very resilient, localized, person-to-person system. if there was ever a time to prove that that was important and also useful, it was now. So yeah, we've really held on to things. And someone in the comments asked about whether we'd had any disruption to supply chain, and the answer really is no. I wouldn't say it's been straightforward, but it's been super interesting. So we've had lots of problems. The millers have been put under great strain. Getting flour in the UK has been difficult, as probably a lot of you are aware. And I think that's a really interesting case study, because there was previously no infrastructure in place for people to buy bread flours at home, even though we are always used to seeing it on the supermarket shelves. So I think people assumed it was something that would always be available, but because no one ever bought it, there was no infrastructure to do it. I mean, millers just don't have equipment for bagging down, and, you know, to that extent. So suddenly when everyone wanted it, they got a bit of a shock because the infrastructure wasn't there. It wasn't because we were short of grain, it wasn't because we were short of flour. So we've suffered a little bit the knock-on effects of everybody chasing flour. I have to say our suppliers have been very loyal. I've been on the phone to, we work with 5 different millers, and I've been on the phone to all of them at least twice a week. When the mill broke down or their van broke down, I just make a call to one of our customers and they would jump in their car and go and fetch flour for us. And that's what a kind of human scale localized food system is like. When the problems occur, you just make a call and it's not a big deal. And I think that's kind of something that we can be proud of. I haven't seen any costs go up, just in response to that question fully as well. I think quite the opposite. I think people have been very proud to maintain their service. And one of the big positive changes to our supply chain is actually we've really starting to benefit from the fact that a lot of really good quality farmers who previously supplied into the restaurant industry have come chasing us to see whether we would like their produce. And that's gone hand in hand with our customers' requirement to diversify our range and become much more of a one-stop grocery shop. So we've actually been able to bring in some really exciting new produce grown by people who really care about what they're doing. And I feel like the network is building. And it's, yeah, there has been a lot of opportunity during this time, even though it's been hard to manage.
Thank you, Kimberley, and thank you, Ching, and thank you also for responding the other question, Kimberley, that was earlier on. Dan, is there time for one more question, or should we move along and continue? There is? Yeah, perhaps one more question for Ching there around what institutional change, apart from food policy councils or food strategies charters, can be put in place to enable a more active food democracy, and how to ensure that this participation is not just cooptation. Any thoughts on that, Ching?
I think, yeah, I mean, I think the danger of cooptation is always there, and that's something that we have to be alert to. I mean, you know, I think in different parts of the world, there have been efforts to try and, you know, bring communities together to be more participatory. I think we have to start from the whole system, right? We have to look first at research, right? A lot of research that has happened in agriculture in the past has been top-down and has not involved farmers, right? So we are looking for a change, and agroecology is about building from farmers' knowledge as well, working together with science. So that's one aspect of democratizing the food system on the production side, where farmers' views and experiences are brought in. Then we have all the way to production to the consumers, linking consumers and producers together in short supply chains, in solidarity economies, community-supported agriculture, etc. I mean, that allows, of course, better interaction and connection. And it's not just about purchasing food. It's about, you know, supporting each other, as Kimberley has pointed out in her earlier intervention. Then I think it's also about, of course, you can have formal fora like food policy councils, debates, etc., that happen and actually impact on policy making. At the end of the day, I think it's got to be a concerted effort by everyone, because, you know, at the end of the day, food, agriculture, it's as we've seen from the crisis and from lockdown, it's so important for all of us. You know, when we have policy making that doesn't just depend on a small number of elite people or from the top down, and we've got to make it a lot more grassroots and bottom up, then I think we can start to change things. This happens also at the international level, and there has been some changes. For example, at the FAO Committee on World Food Security, changes with the reform that happened allow food producers, for example, to have a much stronger voice and say in the international deliberations. And this is still a struggle that we have, bringing farmers' voices to the international level, bringing consumers together, for example. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, brilliant. Thank you, Ching and Kimberley, for that. There may be space to bring in a sort of final reflection or two later on. Would love to hear that in terms of practical bit of advice that you like or insight you'd like people to take away with. But before that, I want to move on to the next pair of speakers. We've already heard quite a lot of talk about values, so who better to talk about that than Tom Crompton from Common Cause Foundation. Tom, yeah, I guess as we think about how can we look at some of the root causes of the multiple issues and emergencies we're facing, values has got a really important part to play. I won't steal Tom's thunder, but I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Dan. Hello, everyone from Machynlleth in mid Wales. It's lovely to be with you. So yeah, I was going to maybe broaden the discussion out a little bit, because what I have to say isn't going to be specific to food. In fact, I have no expertise in food whatsoever, but I wanted to reflect more broadly on the relationship between the way we respond to multiple emergencies. And I wanted to start by drawing a distinction between two responses, which I guess are at opposite ends of the spectrum. A response that centers the most vulnerable and oppressed, that places humanitarian concerns above the needs or demands of the market, that takes full account of the impacts of on other non-human living beings, and one that offers the possibility of systemic and durable solutions rather than short-term or sticking plaster type responses. So I'm going to place that set of responses to emergencies, social and environmental emergencies, at one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, there's a response which I suppose is characterized by the privileging of personal freedom above the protection or care for the most vulnerable, by seeking to blame individuals for the crisis rather than accepting wider collective or government responsibility, that privileges the economy over public health, and that responds callously towards people who are accepting personal risk in the course of looking after others. So these two ends of this spectrum reflect different kinds of values that underpin those responses. And the second of those two responses reflects what social psychologists sometimes refer to as extrinsic values. So these are values, for example, of wealth, of financial success, of authority, of power over people, of social power. Now, one of the key insights that I'm going to be drawing on over the course of the next couple of minutes is that these extrinsic values stand in psychological opposition to values which underpin the first kind of emergency response, that more collaborative or community-based response. The values that underpin that first kind of response are sometimes called intrinsic values. So they include values of social justice, equality, broad-mindedness, love, connection to nature. Now, when I say there's a psychological opposition, I mean that it's actually, clearly there's a political opposition between those two, and we can see that political structures and narratives are built differently, or integrate those values differently. But I mean something more fundamental. there's a basic psychological opposition, that it's psychologically difficult to hold both intrinsic and extrinsic values to be important at the same time. And I also want to suggest that values both beget, but also are begotten by political programs, by which I mean that what political programs on the one hand manifest values and reinforce them in our wider social experience, but they're also built on particular values in this kind of mutually reinforcing feedback loop. So in this sense, the values that infuse a neoconservative political approach are self-reinforcing, because a neoconservative government, for example, uses political discourse and shapes public policy in a way that normalizes and strengthens public acceptance of those extrinsic values. They become a confected form of common sense, if you like. And that, of course, then makes it easier to build future interventions based on those values. So now I'd invite you to see political responses to coronavirus as being part of that process. If these responses model extrinsic values, then they're likely to serve to deepen public acceptance of the normality of those values, and therefore propel that whole political agenda forward in other, possibly in other very different contexts that may seem structurally unrelated to our response to coronavirus. And so then different and more compassionate responses to other emergencies like climate change become more difficult to foresee. So I think Food Ethics Council are absolutely right to highlight the interconnections between different emergencies. And I think what I'm trying to convey is that, as I see it, those interconnections run deeper than structural or policy linkages. So there certainly are important structural connections between an emergency response to COVID and an emergency response to climate change. We can imagine that the material impacts of policies adopted in response to one will rebound on others. So, for example, a more collaborative international response to climate change that prioritizes a stable climate over wealth creation would presumably have stood us in better stead for an international response to COVID, and vice versa. For example, either would have led to the development of strong frameworks for international cooperation. But I'm suggesting a deeper level of interconnection. So our own experiments, for example, at Common Cause Foundation have shown that the values used in communicating about biodiversity loss impact on our willingness to support action on disability rights, seemingly far removed issue, and vice versa. So if you frame an invitation to express concern about biodiversity conservation as an economic imperative, that is in connection, linking with extrinsic values, then you find that support for action on disability rights is diminished. If you frame disability rights as an issue of equality and social justice, in other words, connecting with intrinsic values, then you find that support for action on biodiversity loss increases. So two very separate issues worked on by different parts of the third sector, organizations that may never normally collaborate because they don't see structural or policy intersections between such divergent causes. But the way we communicate on campaign on one, and the values that we to which we appeal in communicating to one are found to have a significant impact on a concern about another. So this is because people carry values over from one context to another. And I think it's regrettable that the third sector more generally, that organizations and networks that exist to meet social and environmental challenges don't do more to reflect that fabric of common values. Our organizations and networks tend to define themselves in terms of the causes that they work on rather than the values that they champion. But people's values aren't neatly compartmentalized in the way that we neatly compartmentalize third sector concerns like biodiversity loss or disability rights. So as a result, we find organizations working on, say, climate change that appeal to both intrinsic and extrinsic values in their messaging. So you could imagine that many organizations working on climate change would see no contradiction in simultaneously campaigning on the grounds of the wealth creation opportunities of the renewables industry, an appeal to extrinsic values, and the desecration of other species, an appeal to intrinsic values. Yet the values upon which these two appeals are based stand in psychological opposition to one another. So I'm just going to close by making some suggestions about what might need to happen if we're going to begin to change that situation and strive for greater coherence in the values to which we appeal, both within the ambit of the issues or causes upon which we work, but also crucially across social and environmental organizations and networks. And I think beginning to work in that way offers the possibility of beginning to mount some kind of response to that vicious circle that I drew attention to at the start of the values inherent to a political discourse being both modeled by and strengthened in that discourse or those political projects. So my invitation is that we begin to look beyond our particular cause and ask how might we connect our audiences. Of course, audiences that are united by a concern about the cause upon which we work with other causes that may seem far removed, but which are connected through the values which energize concern about them. And we can do that, I'll suggest, by surfacing and celebrating the shared intrinsic values. So I want to show you an example of a communication of this type, inspired by the work of Common Cause, which was produced by a biodiversity conservation organisation as an attempt to build understanding among their supporters of the values which underpinned concern, to raise awareness amongst their supporters of the values that underpinned those people's concern about biodiversity loss could also be celebrated in a very different context, here in the context of a debate about marriage equality. So Dan, if you wouldn't mind sharing my one slide. Thank you. So this is an image taken from a campaign run by the Australian Conservation Foundation, which shared images like this in social media with their supporters in the context of a public debate in Australia a couple of years ago about same-sex marriage. And I think it's a wonderful example of the way in which they reached out to an audience united in their concern about biodiversity loss. That's why they were supporting ACF, but doing so in a way which forges that link in a values, through the shared values, with an issue that seems structurally, in structural and policy terms, to be so far removed from concern about biodiversity loss. And that in doing so, recognised and celebrated the commonality of those values. So I think it points to a new way of thinking about solidarity across social and environmental causes, one that's rooted in intrinsic values, and one which I think inevitably we're going to have to move towards if we're to envisage more systemic and sustained action on multiple emergencies, emergencies that we can only really foresee proportional responses to when we begin to centre the intrinsic values which are so often suppressed in mainstream political responses that we see at the moment. Brilliant. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Tom. That's fantastic. I could listen to all of our speakers for hours, but no, genuinely, I think fascinating. And another very apt. Tomorrow is International Biodiversity Day, to talk about the importance of biodiversity, but about, as you said, organisations defining via their values rather than as single issue, separate causes. I think is really, really important. Thank you, Tom. There's a few questions coming through. Before we do that, I want to, last but by no means least, hand over to Sally, Chief Executive of Forum for the Future, who has worked with a range of organisations in the food system over the last couple of decades, probably fair to say, Sally. And yeah, so hear your thoughts on how you think we should be responding. and what you're seeing?
Great, thanks, Dan. Yeah, Forum for the Future, we're an international sustainability non-profit. We're trying to accelerate progress towards sustainable development by catalyzing change in key systems, and we take a deliberately systemic approach to understand how we can drive positive outcomes, and we spend a lot of time in the food system. So I've been asked to pull together what I think needs to happen in terms of actions from all the different actors that we know need to work together to potentially allow us to come out of this crisis in not just a better shape, but a different shape. And I guess the starting point is to reflect on where we are right now from a systems perspective, which is that we are right now in a major moment of accelerated systems transformation, an incredible moment of discontinuity. It's really hard. We don't even know what's going to happen tomorrow. Everything is changing at every level. Surface events are changing and deep held mindsets are shifting at the same time. So whilst that is deeply, deeply unsettling and causes anxiety, it is also a major moment for us to reimagine and to reform the systems upon which we rely. So the opportunity, if you will, is to harness all of that dynamism, all of that change, and actually repattern the food system, our economic system, in a way that actually is in line with sustainable development. At Forum, as Dan knows, we spend a lot of our time scanning all these future trajectories, looking at trends, looking at weak signals. We very much subscribe to the quote from William Gibson, who said, "The future is already here, it's all around us, it's just unevenly distributed." So how can we understand those weak signals as a way of then creating the trajectory that we want? And we're seeing three possible trajectories emerge out of this crisis, and I don't have time to go into them in any great detail. The first, which is where we're spending our time to try and maximize the chance of this emerging, is what we're calling the transform trajectory, which is effectively a shift towards an economy and a society that has regenerative goals at its heart. And so this is the weak signals that you're seeing in cities like Amsterdam, new business models emerging. That transform trajectory, there are signals that it's already happening. We then have the disciplinarian trajectory, which is a tech-enabled, quite controlled way forward. We're already seeing that in terms of contact tracing. In many countries, public health protection has been put first and foremost as compared to privacy. And then the third trajectory is a really bleak one. Again, we're seeing signs of this, which we're cheerily calling collapse. And this is where there's not enough of everything. And we see nation states retreating. And we're already seeing it in corona xenophobia. I really want everyone to focus on the transform trajectory. And we all have a role to play in delivering that. And I've got 4 actions for everybody to really hopefully embrace. So when I'm thinking of these actions, I'm thinking about business, government, investors, philanthropy, and I'll come on to citizens last if I may. So number 1 is that we need to build and maintain our understanding of the interconnectivity of these issues. Planetary health equals human health equals economic health. They are inextricably linked. We can't pull them apart. And I think this pandemic has shone a light on that interconnectivity. So how do we understand the world as an interconnected set of issues and use that understanding to then drive multiple benefits in multiple systems? And agroecology, regenerative agriculture, great examples of activities that you can engage with that drive multiple benefits in multiple systems. Number 2, we all need to work to a different set of goals for our current food system, for our economic system. The food system isn't broken. It's working really well to the current goals of that system, which is often efficiency, short-term profit maximization. Equally, the economic system isn't broken. It's working really well to the current roles of the capital system. So how do we start to reframe the goals of our economy so that they broaden out and include social and environmental outcomes? Number 3, we need to carry on collaborating. We've seen some brilliant collaborations and new partnerships emerge in this pandemic. Really absolutely profound partnerships between public and private sectors working together properly. How do we carry on that collaboration? And then the fourth action for us all is to hold multiple timeframes. In a crisis, it's really easy and understandable to focus on now. How are we going to survive? That horizon one. But actually, we also need to move from that more managerial mindset. So how am I going to cut costs? How am I going to survive till tomorrow? To that more entrepreneurial mindset, so horizon two, into that visionary mindset. So what is the future that we want? How do we get there? That horizon three. We need to hold different timeframes in our minds. For businesses specifically, on that holding multiple timeframes, we need businesses to really step into that horizon two and to build resilience in their supply chains, in their communities. And yes, Kimberley, I think that is about being human-centered in that approach. And we also simultaneously need businesses to define their purpose. What is their role in a reframed economy? How is a business going to contribute to an economy which has got regeneration at the heart? For government, I've got three asks. We need to ensure that stimulus packages, fiscal packages have sustainability outcomes linked to them. So what are those long-term climate-friendly sustainable packages? We're seeing them emerge from the IFC, from the City of Amsterdam. We need more of those. Number two, for governments, we need to ensure multilateralism stays. If it doesn't, we are looking at collapse. Number three, governments just need to relax the red tape. We've seen how that can happen. So let's understand how we can be more adaptive and emergent in policy making. And then finally, and I could go on for a lot longer, but I'm conscious of time, the role of citizens, I think, is really, really interesting. And that's us. And I think I agree with previous contributions that COVID-19 ultimately is a human story. It's a story of human loss, human suffering, human endeavor, human resilience. And I think the action for us all is to understand our own power, our own agency, yes, our values, and to understand what can we do as individuals, but what can we all do as part of a bigger collective endeavor. And I think, therefore, we all have an ability to shape the future that we want. And it's down to all of us to really leverage our skills, our assets, our beliefs, our values to really ensure that that transformed trajectory becomes the one that we find ourselves on.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sally. A fantastic way to, well, still time for questions, a fantastic way to kind of sum up the complexity, the urgency of that transformation, and some practical things that need to happen across the board. I would say this because we're particularly focusing on this at the moment, but the whole food citizenship, we've been doing a lot of work on that shift from consumerism to food citizenship, changing that mindset. And treating each other as food citizens with compassion and dignity. We've just put out a shameless plug, just put out a comms toolkit on food citizenship, which is on foodcitizenship.info, which I would urge you to go and have a look at if you're interested in that. We've got about 10 minutes or so just to take some questions and comments and particularly for Sally and Tom, and then we'll sort of wrap up with final reflections. So really, I hand over to you for questions for Sally and
Thanks, Dan. Thank you for our speakers again. I might start from the bottom then, and a question for Sally. Sally, how do you see the community wealth building playing a role going forward?
Community what? Sorry, Vila?
Wealth building.
I'm not sure I actually understand the question in terms of building the strength of communities.
I guess so. I'm not sure I understand the question either, to be honest. And sorry for posing it to you, but I guess it means, yeah, community strength.
Yeah. I mean, I think that continuing to build resilient communities and sustainable communities is at the heart of that transformed trajectory. And I think one of the positive signs of what we've experienced, certainly here in the West, in this pandemic, has we've seen communities, both virtual, such as the one we have here today, and real, really come together. So I'm looking outside at my street from my dining room table. Our street has this vibrant WhatsApp group. It's a sharing economy gone large. And I think that we've seen communities really understand what it means to support one another. And I think that's a fabulous foundation from which to build. And I think as we emerge from this crisis, I don't think individuals are going to want to let that go, because I think it's been a source of huge comfort and a source of real richness as we've faced some really dark times, particularly here in the UK over the last few weeks. So I think for me, community resilient, sustainable communities are a central plank of that transform trajectory.
Thank you, Sally. There's one more question for you, but I would also welcome any thoughts from Tom as well, if there is any. There is a clear interconnection, I think, as you mentioned, between the health of the planet and our health. I think there is sometimes a disconnection in our minds that we don't belong into our planet, it was something different. What do you say is the best way to communicate that interrelation, and actually our planet and us are one and the same?
Yeah, I think, again, and I'm beginning to sound like an eternal optimist, one of the positive outcomes, again, of this crisis is that for those that had any doubt of the link between the planet's health and our health, it's so clear now. And I think that shining a light on the interconnections of the systems that we rely on is where you start. And in fact, at Forum, we have a strand of work looking at planetary health and people health. So looking at that climate health intersection and making it real. So, for example, urging businesses to play their role in air quality. We reduce air quality, we actually improve productivity, but we also improve people's health. So the more examples of how we can both solve for climate and health simultaneously that we can share with particularly the business community, the better. And there are lots of examples out there too. So soil health will drive greater carbon sequestration. It also contributes to more nutritious food, which then improves personal health and well-being. And so really shining a light on these interconnections is a way of helping organizations simultaneously solve for more than one challenge.
Thank you, Sally. Tom, would you have any additional thoughts on that?
No, I don't know.
Thank you. Perhaps a question for you, Tom, going a bit backwards in the chat room. There was some discussion and very interesting point from Anna from Food Ethics Council that actually there is an extrinsic motivated people or intrinsic motivated people per se, but actually there are people that have been exposed to one more than the other, and we should we should perhaps all promote a bit more the intrinsic ones. However, there is a little bit of a debate that the challenge is that there is a bit more louder support towards extrinsic values coming in the current political climate that actually could cause longer term harm. How do you think we can respond to that kind of more dominant framing on the extrinsic values?
Yeah, thank you. I've been keeping an eye on the chat, and thank you, Anna, for your great responses to some of those questions. Well, I think a couple of things within that may be worth unpacking. One is the observation that some people are apparently, or at least are pigeonholed as being motivated by extrinsic values. And I think it's easy to assume that for them, in some way, the intrinsic values are inaccessible. I think perhaps we suffer from the importation of kind of social marketing approaches to movement building. And I think if you're selling soap, it doesn't really matter what values you appeal to. Your sole metric for success is how many units of soap you sell. And if you shift people's values in an unhelpful direction through your advertising, that doesn't matter. It's something you would never think to seek to measure. We're not in that position. When we communicate or campaign on social or environmental issues, we have an intense interest in asking what values is it that we're engaging and over time strengthening in the course of those campaigns and communications, and are they helpful to our broader cause? And if the answer to that is no, then in terms of our long-term strategy, we would do well to desist from appeal to those extrinsic values. But I would go further. So we've run experiments where we've deliberately selected people who are especially extrinsically oriented. And we've shown, first of all, trivially, that those people still have access to intrinsic values, right? They still love their communities. They still love the places they live. They still have capacity to be kind to people. The question is, which of those values do we bring to the fore? And we find that even amongst people who are unusually motivated by extrinsic values, it's framing social or environmental concerns in terms of intrinsic values, which is more effective in leading them to express a concern or intend to support work on social environment and environmental challenges.
Thank you, Tom. Dan, is there time for perhaps one more question? Yeah, we have a question from Patty Whaley, and they were posed that one of the questions that is being questioned at the moment in the food sector is the value of efficiency. For example, having an efficient JIT delivery system, no spare capacity, etc., versus being resilient, which means in a way planning for less than your optimum performance. How does this, do you see this fit into the extrinsic intrinsic dichotomy, Tom?
Could you maybe given your knowledge of the of food, could you just unpack that for a bit? What does it mean to be operating, and what was your phrase, at a less than full capacity?
So in a way planning, which means in a way planning for less than your optimum performance.
What does that
Dan,
mean?
do you have any more thoughts to give on this, Dan, perhaps from your point of view?
I think, well, I guess a broader point is about, and it again links a little bit to Sally's bit about goals of the system as well, but the point about efficiency, to what extent is that sort of having that as the ultimate goal, driving and shaping the responses below? I guess maybe a question for Sally first, then we can come back to
yeah, I mean, I think that one of the key shifts that we need to make when we think about the goals of the food system is a shift from a set of goals that are predicated on efficiency. You know, that's a primary driver of what happens in the food system, to actually a goal of, you know, building environmental and social value at the same time as economic value. And I think if that shift could begin to happen, then we'd understand that being efficient doesn't equate to being sustainable at all. They're not the same thing. And just to watch out as we emerge from this crisis on those words, efficient and resilient. So at the moment in global supply chains in particular, specifically in the apparel sector, there's a lot of talk about building resiliency in supply chains. Now, some ways of achieving that is to move to AI and to actually reduce the access to economic development for millions of garment workers around the world. And so again, it points to really being clear, what is the goal of the system? And just being clear that actually it can't, well, it is just efficiency at the moment, and that leads to all sorts of unintended consequences. So I think being clear that the goals need to shift, and imagining in individual organizations' role in shifting those goals is probably one of the most important things we need to do.
Thank you. And perhaps we've got time for one very quick last question or thought. My chat box is moving too fast for me to find the questions, but there was one other question for Tom. Do you want me to feed that in, Aurelia? Are you happy for me to do that?
Yes, go ahead, Dan, of course.
So I guess, and the efficiency one was about sort of just-in-time approach that we've got, but let's perhaps move on from that. The question for Tom, there was one about, from Matthew, I think it was, how do you see the increasing success and prevalence of sort of natural capital and ecosystem services approaches in driving, you know, positive policy change and business engagement? Is there the sort of question here, are these specifically targeting extrinsic values over intrinsic values but making progress? So that's, yeah, the suggestion that if you frame things in that way, that's targeting extrinsic values. Is that, I guess, would you agree with that? If we're you know, about increasing success and prevalence of natural capital, for example, are you in support of that as a way of framing how we respond?
Thanks. Yeah. I think you're absolutely right that framing the imperative for biodiversity conservation in financial terms is an appeal to what I've called extrinsic values. And I think it's likely to be deeply corrosive for that reason, for the foundation upon which most people express concern about biodiversity loss, which for most of us isn't about economic impact. It's about the loss of things that we love, either because we've experienced it in childhood or because we've seen it through David Attenborough films, or because it's been part of stories that have been important to us. And I think there's a real danger in reframing the value of biodiversity in narrow financial terms, which isn't to say that, you know, I'm oblivious to the opportunity or need to do that if you're constrained to talking about people whose jobs require them to think solely in terms of economic calculus. If you're talking to a treasury official or a chief finance operator. But unfortunately, that discourse hasn't been contained with those people. It's leached out into public debate. So I know that an otter is worth £11.63 because I read it in The Guardian. That changes my relationship with an otter in a way that I think is deeply damaging. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much, Sally and Tom and Avrilia, for hosting that, and lots of too many contributions to feed in on the chat, but we can share the notes from that and the links. We'll do a write-up of this and share that next week. We'll also share the recording so people can listen back. Some people haven't been able to join for the whole of it. But just for the last, we've got 7 or 8 minutes left. I would urge those of you still here to stay on. There are some important things to wrap up. I guess the first thing I'd say is in a couple of minutes, I'll come to Leanne, who's been harvesting some of this, and we'll be able to share that sort of work in progress, some of the key themes that have come out from this. But what I wanted to do was just go back to Mentimeter before, whilst I'm hopefully getting Mentimeter to work this time. I'll come back in a couple of minutes just to give people warning, the speakers, that I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes for a kind of what's your key one takeaway, what's the key one insight, key message you want people to come away with. Again, if we are to try and address multiple emergencies, what's your sort of one takeaway message for everybody? Before we do that, so I'll just go back to the Mentimeter just for a moment. So again, a reminder that this is on menti.com 396371. A number of you have already answered this, but if you haven't, please do. This question: how much do you agree with statements we've got here? So our government's response to the multiple emergencies we face is sufficient. We should deal with COVID-19 first and only then act on other emergencies. We should seek to address multiple emergencies simultaneously, and I find the use of emergency language helpful. There's a sliding scale from strongly disagree, a low number, to strongly agree. Just interested in people's responses to those 4 quite separate questions. Just give you a moment or two just to think through and respond on them. So just to read them out again as you're going through. So the first one, our government's response to the multiple emergencies we face is adequate. Generally, most people so far disagreeing with that statement. Second one is we should deal with COVID-19 first and only then act on the other emergencies we face. Again, general tendency towards disagreeing, but that's slightly more towards the middle. The next one, we should seek to address multiple emergencies simultaneously, very strongly in the strongly agree camp. And then the last question, which is interesting, I find the use of emergency language helpful, is sort of hovering around the middle. Again, I fluctuate. I find the urgency that language brings helpful, but it can be disempowering or potentially can only work for a period of time. But thank you for responding on that. Last couple of questions on this in terms of reflections, then I'll come back to the key speakers and to Leanne for a final sharing of her notes. So the question is, what insight have you taken from today's food talks? And this is an open text box, so don't write a long paragraph, just a short sentence. What's the sort of takeaway insight you have from today's discussion? What's something you've learned, something that surprised you, something that's reinforced perhaps what you were thinking of already? Is there a key word or a key phrase that you take away? Already people responding on this. We will share we can share the results of the Mentimeter when we share the write-up with participants next week. So I won't attempt to read through all of these, but some lots in there about diversifying, diverse approach, the value of food, the work of common cause, people focus, community togetherness, diversity again, about the importance of mindsets and values, encouragement for the shift towards local foods, in short supply chains, different set of goals, the need, very much what Sally talked about, appealing to values, the intrinsic, extrinsic point, interconnectivity, etc. I could go on. I will stop there, but keep sharing away, keep responding on that. I'll give you a couple of minutes just leaving that open. just a couple of moments. Perhaps whilst people are responding on that, before I ask you to do the last one, perhaps I could just come back to, I'll leave that on screen for now, but come back just to the speakers first of all, just literally sort of 20 seconds, no more, because we haven't got much time, but just what's your sort of one takeaway message? And perhaps let's do that in the order that they spoke. So Kimberley first, and then Ching. So Kimberley, do you want to kick off with a one takeaway?
Yeah, I guess I think it's worth just bringing it back to who were the first responders. And I think if you are looking at food systems and improving food systems, I think we need to just remember who's on the front line. And so I'd like everyone to just consider a bit more the role of a food worker or a food processor, a food retailer, and ask whether or not in their work to improve policy or to advocate for change in systems, whether they're including them in the conversation enough. Because actually I find often that we skip from farmer to policymaker to consumer or food citizen, as you more gracefully put it. We often overlook those who actually work in the system, and I think we have, us speaking from the point of view of somebody who works in the system, we are actually some of the biggest sort of opportunities for change. If we can change how we feel about where we sit in the system, if we can change how empowered we feel to make a difference and change our own values, as well as the way people value us, I think actually that's a very powerful agent for change in all of the, as Tom so eloquently put it, interconnected issues and emergencies that we need to address, which are yeah, I agree, are not separate. Brilliant.
Thank you, Kimberley. Very quickly on to Ching, if you're there, Ching, a very final, quick reflection from yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I really agree very much with what Kimberley has said already. And I would add, I mean, I think, you know, we need to really address things in a systemic manner. We can't, sit in silos and look at one perspective only. But we have to take a much more holistic approach because the root causes are holistic. The very root causes are in the basis of the flawed economic systems that we have in place at the moment, and the flawed values, etc. So we need to take a systemic approach. And I would argue that a food systems approach that incorporates agroecology, social justice, workers' rights, community rights, sustainability, all these aspects are absolutely essential to how we transform the food system. Thanks.
Thank you, Ching. Echo that. Tom, very, very quickly, point from you.
Well, I guess just that I think there's a lot of agreement on what needs to change, and we wring our hands at the difficulty of creating change. And I'd just like you to invite you to think of values as one potential tool to help address that challenge of how we actually create the changes we're united in recognizing we want. Thanks.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tom. And finally, Sally.
Yeah, take the time to understand the root causes of the problem you're trying to solve. Dig deep, find out what's driving the problem you're trying to solve, and you probably will find that it's mindsets and values and narratives, and shifting those will shift the broader system.
Brilliant. And certainly we at the Ethics Council, I know the other partners in this are very big supporters of shifting values, mindsets. It's been a big, deep conversation. In the last literally sort of minute or so, Leanne, I don't know if you're there, and I'm not conscious I'm giving you sort of 30 seconds of time rather than anything longer, but are you, if we can perhaps, is it worth handing over to you very, very briefly, just to flash in front of people what you have?
Great. Cable.
And Leanne has been capturing notes, so we'll just give a few kind of flash those in front of you if that works.
Okay, so it's pretty full and a rough draft of a harvest with some. I'll highlight the key points when they came up, and then there was so much depth and lots of great questions as well. So I will try and bring that all in, but it was just a quick look at what you'll see later on in a more tidy version. Okay, thanks. Brilliant,
thank you, Leanne. That's fantastic. I'd love to dive into that. That's a brilliant capture of a huge range of insights. Thank you ever so much, Leanne, for that. So by way of close, thank you ever so much, everyone, for joining. Thank you in particular to our speakers, to Tom, to Sally, to Ching, and to Kimberley. I guess I wanted to close, if you'll permit me, my last 30 seconds with one slide, which I hope you can see, which is our planet. And to quote, so Jeff Tansey, who I think was on the call, member of the Food Ethics Council, but also curates the Food Systems Academy. He talks about, you know, wherever we are, whichever country we live in, whatever belief system we follow, this is the big picture of what we should call home. It's a beautiful, amazingly diverse land and sea with diversity of cultures, diversity of people. What is global is local, and what is local is global, and that's been reinforced very much by the pandemic. So I guess my kind of closing message is, you know, please do, you know, this is home. Let's look after our home, and do get behind the collective action that will drive us in a better direction. Let's build back better, as I say, but as we've heard already, we can build differently. We don't need to build back to where we were before. So huge thank you. Thanks to Esme again for supporting. Thanks to Impact Hub King's Cross, to local food links, London Food Links, Sustain, and Organico. Thanks for our speakers. And yeah, please do stay safe, well, resilient, if my computer doesn't move around. And yeah, we look forward to being in touch with you soon. Do stay as part of the community. Aurelia, did you want to say a final quick closing comment on the community app?
Yeah, sure. We at Impact Hub King's Cross have an online platform called the Community App, which is basically hosting social enterprises to share news, ideas, opportunities. We want to make an offer to Food Docs participants to join it for free, and we will create a group which will be hosted by us and our Food Docs partners, where we will be able to continue the discussion there and allow you to share ideas between you, which we have been doing to the chat. Keep an eye on your emails. We will follow up with information on how to join, and also the recording and the notes that Food Ethics Council are harvesting.
Brilliant. Thank you, Aurelia. Well, thanks everyone. So yeah, we are part of this community. There are lots of people that want to create positive change. We have to work hard to make it happen. It's not inevitable that it will all fall into place. So let's build on the amazing stuff we're doing, build that resilience, and yeah, hopefully we will shape better food system and better society. So thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully see you again soon.